is when everything changes.
This is not about guilt. This is about what doesn't line up. I've read thousands of court documents over the years, and I've read all 2,000 pages of the discovery in the Christopher Watts case. What I'm sharing here is based on publicly available records, interviews, and forensic reports. Some of this is factual, some of it is my personal analysis. But it's not an accusation, and it's not a legal conclusion. It's simply me trying to explain why this case still will not let me go. Welcome to the Jane Doe Files. Let's finally deep dive on NK and Chris Watts.
I couldn't do it.
What bothers me about this case isn't just the crime. It's the absence of warning signs. Chris Watts wasn't described as volatile. He wasn't described as abusive. He wasn't described as controlling. He was described as quiet, passive, a yes man, a hands-on father, a husband people believed adored his family. Nobody described an unraveling. And affairs happen every day. They don't usually end in the annihilation of an entire family. And when something escalates this far, this fast, without anyone seeing it coming, he snapped just does not fly with me, guys. It doesn't. So here's what we know. In the early morning hours of August 13, 2018, Shanann Watts arrived home around 1:48 a.m. Sometime after that, she and her two daughters were unalived, along with her unborn son. Chris Watts then transported their bodies to an oil site known as Survey 319. And in November of 2018, he pled guilty to avoid the death penalty, and he was sentenced to multiple life sentences. Those sentences are set to be served consecutively. Those facts are not disputed. Chris Watts is the only person who has ever been held legally accountable for this crime. And legally, I understand why the investigation stopped where it did. They had their man. A guilty plea answers the question of who committed the crime. But it doesn't always answer why. And for people like me, people who read discovery, who analyze timelines, unresolved inconsistencies are hard to ignore.
Are there, and all that. It's just speculation. But it's kind of like, why did you do that?
This is where Nicole Kessinger enters the conversation. And not because of internet theories, not because I believe she committed the unaliving. It's the continuous inconsistencies that I continue to find in all of the evidence. For example, she states she never talked about him with her friends, ever.
So you don't tell your friends, hey,
No, because people come and go.
But investigators knew that was a lie. She'd been talking with Charlotte a lot about how much she liked him. And anytime contradiction is pointed out, her demeanor shifts. She becomes defensive. She asks why investigators are even asking if they already have her text.
Okay, I don't need anybody.
In the beginning, she really gave them all kinds of reasons as to why she really didn't want to share any of her texts with them at all.
Objections to us looking at everything in your phone.
Why do you even need that? I'm just curious. Like, why do you need everything at the phone?
So let's pause here, because the issue isn't that she was embarrassed by content of messages. The issue is that her phone represented the most complete time-stamped record of communication with the last person connected to this family before it was annihilated. In cases like this, phones don't just show what was said, they show when, how often, and what stops. And any resistance to handing over that data matters, because delays create gaps, and gaps are where timelines fall apart, especially when those gaps cannot be reconstructed later. And this is where the Celebrite report becomes so important, not because it proves a crime, but because it documents so many limitations. According to the forensic extraction, investigators noted that Chris Watts was transferring images to a secret calculator application. We saw that just a minute ago. Images that were not reflected in the standard phone timeline. Images that had to be located manually, file by file, based on curiosity, not because they appeared naturally in the data. And the report states clearly that this method of communication makes it impossible to know the full extent of the contact between them. That's not speculation, that's straight from the forensic report. Which means we don't actually know how much communication occurred, we don't know how often, and we don't know what was deleted. Only that deletion happened. And when someone tells investigators they barely talked, while the data itself says we can't even measure how much they talked, that's not a small discrepancy. If you've watched any of my other videos, you've heard me talk about the phone ping before, but a deep dive like this has to be included, because it's not a side detail, it's a timeline anchor. According to the available data, Nicole Kessinger's phone pings at a tower in Frederick, Colorado at 6:16 a.m. on August 13th. That matters because that is a tower she historically only pinged when she was physically near or at the Watts residence. It also matters because this ping occurs during a period where her phone activity is otherwise usually quiet, following a late night call with Watts that overlaps Shanann's arrival home. And what's notable here isn't just the ping itself, it's the absence of meaningful follow-up questions about it. There's just literally no clear explanation ever given, no reconstruction attempt that's documented, no resolution. That doesn't prove anything, but it leaves a major gap. This is where I'm going to leave NK for now, not because there aren't more inconsistencies, not because there aren't unanswered questions, but because at some point speculation just stops being useful. What matters is what's documented and what was never fully explained. And in this case, there are documented contradictions, incomplete timelines, and acknowledged limitations in the data itself. That doesn't mean she committed a crime. It does mean, however, the narrative that we have been given is not as clean as often presented. And at the end of the day, this case always circles back to the same thing for me. Chris Watts took a plea. Today, he is the only one that has ever been held legally accountable. This isn't about shifting guilt. It's about something much harder to sit with. That a case can be legally resolved in the eyes of the law without ever even being understood. That people can know way more than they'll ever admit. And that once accountability is established, the system often stops asking questions that don't change the outcome. For people like me, people who need patterns to make sense, that's deeply unsatisfying. We want a why. And sometimes there's just not a clear one. Sometimes justice isn't complete. Chris Watts is where accountability ends, but for me, that's just where the questions begin.
Is a hero.
If you have made it this far, I appreciate you so much. Thanks for watching the Jane Doe Files. Chris Watts Deep Dive.